Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Creation Corner with your host, David McNabb. So glad you came back to the Creation Corner. And we're going to be talking about David Peeples' book, and it's called The Mystery of Life, What's It All About? And and there's also Discovering the Truth in a Skeptical World. Now, before we get started with that, I wanted to tell you a little story because I was talking just this last weekend and to a group of folks, and we were talking about what differences between the men and the women, and afterwards, this woman got kind of heated, and she came up to me and said, "Now, just where would you men be without us women?" And I looked at her and said, "In the Garden of Eden." Well, she didn't really like that too much, so she kicked me. No, that's just a story. But, we always opened with a joke, and that was my attempt at a joke. Now, I have David Peeples with me today. He's local to Prescott Valley, and he's written this excellent book, which I've begun to read but have not finished yet, called The Mystery of Life, What's It All About? And David, thank you for being my guest on today's show. Where did you get your picture for the book?
Well, that's interesting. Are you familiar with Getty Photos?
No.
Getty Photos? Okay, so I saw this photo and I had to track down who owned it. And it turned out that it's owned by an estate in Sweden.
Oh, really?
So I had to write them, email them to get access to that photo. And I just felt like it really says the title. Mm-hmm. What is life all about? Well, obviously there's human life in this universe.
Yeah. And you've got a human embryo and then a universe expansion around it, which is pretty amazing. I mean, it is a very unusual picture, and it's really neat. And so you saw this where? Just happened to see it?
This was in a Life magazine book that my mother had, and it was published in there, and I was able to track it down to an estate in Sweden. The gentleman that took the photo, his estate owns the rights to it.
Wow.
So
very cool. Well, why did you write it, and when did you write it?
Okay, so the reason I wrote the book was I wanted to expose a false worldview. And evolution is the basis of that worldview. So if you expose the errors of evolution, then you have an opportunity to lay groundwork for a worldview that is supported by the evidence. Mm-hmm. And so that was kind of the objective.
And when did you write it?
Well, I've gathered material for a long time, and I've had notes that were tucked away here and there, but I really started putting it together about 2008. I really started focusing on, getting the material, getting it in written form, getting the references all organized and editing. Mm-hmm. There's thought, there's writing, there's editing, and then the production process. And all of that took about 10 years.
Okay, and it was printed in 2018.
2018.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And you can get this on Amazon, correct?
Yes, in fact, I would recommend that because I think they have the best price.
Yeah, they usually do.
I think it's around $18 on Amazon.
Okay. And that's a good price for a book this big. It's 440 some pages. So it is a big book, but believe me, it's worth the read. Hang in there with it, and you'll get through it. Let's look at the chapters here. The first chapter is called "The Origin of Life," and describe what you have basically in that chapter for us.
Okay, so the origin of life we talk about the idea of how did life come about. And so what I start with is defining the terms. Defining the worldview of naturalism, where evolution is the cause of the origin of life, or the creation account, the biblical account of creation. So I start by defining those terms, because when people talk about evolution, there's different ways that it's defined. Some people just define evolution as change, or minor change. And to me, that's not really what I'm talking about. When I say evolution, I'm talking about macroevolution, where you have giant leaps from one species to a whole different kind, or talking about spontaneous generation, where how did life chemically come together. So people talk about different aspects of evolution, stellar evolution and chemical evolution and so on. But basically I'm focused on macroevolution and the generation of life at the beginning.
Yes, so macroevolution is one kind of animal becoming another kind of animal, and that transition, even though there's no transitional forms in the fossil record to support that, that's still a very common belief that's taught as fact to the kids, and unfortunately in public schools. But I'm looking in the first chapter here, and you do say that over 60% of Americans still believe in the traditional origin view of special creation. So even though it's taught as a fact, we still have a lot of folks out there, the majority of folks, that don't buy that malarkey.
No,
right?
they haven't bought into it.
Right.
There's different opinions about how God created, but the majority of people still hold to a creation that involved an intelligent agent working by his own will.
Right, absolutely.
Can I read this quote from
Please.
Darwin?
Sure.
This is in the first chapter. I have a section called Doubting Darwin. He says, natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad and preserving and adding up that which is good, silently and insensibly working at the improvement of each organic being. Now, that's a big leap to say that natural selection is picking out all the good and preserving it and getting rid of all that is bad. And the problem with that is, when you start looking at mutations, they're 99.9% bad.
Oh, yeah.
So natural selection doesn't have a lot of good to pick from.
That's right. And even the so-called good mutations come at a huge cost. So are they really good? No, not really.
Not to the plant. What if I like seedless watermelon? You probably do too.
Yeah.
That's kind of nice for us.
Right.
But the plant can't reproduce itself.
Exactly.
That's a problem.
Okay. And anything else in that first chapter that you want to go over?
Yeah, I think there's some other section here I wanted to look at. For example, the dogmatic claims that evolutionists make. I find them to be, Darwin, if you read his material, he wasn't that dogmatic about, he was presenting a basis for the evolution of life, but he didn't make dogmatic claims about it.
Right.
Okay? These people in this century have made claims such as Julian Huxley, biologist. The first point about Darwin's theory is that it's no longer a theory, but a fact. Darwinism has come of age, so to speak. We are no longer having to bother with establishing the fact of evolution. And on. The claims are so dogmatic that I guess if you say something dogmatic over and over and over, people tend to believe it.
That's right.
Especially if you have a voice in the public arena.
Exactly. There's a quote that I like to say here on the Creation Corner, and it goes like this: "Nothing is too absurd to be believed if it is repeated often enough." And that's exactly what you're saying there.
Yeah.
And even though this is absurd, it's repeated all the time, especially if you're in public school.
Yeah.
It really gets repeated. Or if you turn on the documentaries on animals, then that gets really repeated there. I saw here, you list some of the great scientists of the past, and note that they're all Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Every one of them. And, of the 200 branches of science, they say there's about 190 of those 200 were started by devout Christians.
Exactly.
So that says a lot about science. And why is that? What do you think that is, David, that Christians...
Well, in fact, the scientific revolution really found its foundation in a Christian cradle.
Mm-hmm.
It was a Christian influence that caused people like Galileo to search for understanding, because they were trying to search out the mind of God. How did he do that?
Yes.
And so forth. But I find that the creation account has a lot going for it. And when you look at the history, the science, the quotations of those early pioneers, you find that they didn't see any conflict between faith and science.
Absolutely. Empirical science we're talking about here.
That's right.
That follows the scientific method. In fact, the scientific method was created by a Christian. And you have also, here I'm looking at, random explosions lacking any intelligent guidance will always produce pure chaos and disorder. They will never produce organization, beauty, and useful complexity. Well, isn't it obvious that explosions create chaos and not order? But even though that's absurd to say that a Big Bang explosion would create all the order that we see in the universe.
I know.
That's completely absurd. But if it's repeated often enough, it'll be believed.
Well, they have to come up with an explanation to get it started, right?
Yeah.
And so they come up with this singularity or this cosmic egg that exploded, or.
Yeah.
But I want to define the difference between macroevolution and microevolution.
Oh, please do.
Okay. So microevolution is the idea that kinds of plants and animals have within their genetic makeup the ability to adapt to their surroundings, to their environment, producing different traits that make the animal more likely to survive. So, like, example, if you're a fox and you're living in the Arctic, in the snow, if you have a white coat, you have a much better chance of survival than a fox with a red coat.
Sure.
So God put within the genome the ability to adapt and to change, but never to change from one kind to another kind.
Right.
So that's microevolution. I don't have a problem with that. I just don't like the term. It's confusing.
Right.
And people try to take microevolution and say that's the basis of evolution. And it's not.
No.
You know, Darwin's finches, if you want to call it that, there's really God's finches, but Darwin's finches, they varied because they had the genetic ability to adapt to their environment, whether it was a hot climate, a wet climate, and so on. And so that's just variation within a kind. And so that's what I call it, variation within a kind. Macroevolution, on the other hand, is making giant leaps, like a cow becoming a whale, making giant leaps that would require multiple, maybe thousands of beneficial mutations. And it's pretty absurd to imagine.
It is, because it's never been shown. We don't observe that. So it's just not logical to think that that happened in the past. Many scientists simply assume these intermediate forms must have existed, in spite of the overwhelming lack of evidence in the fossil record. So that's from your page 12 there, in that first chapter that we're talking about, what we just said here. How can we account for species when crossed being sterile and producing sterile offspring, whereas where varieties are crossed, their fertility is unimpaired? Say something about that.
So I believe that God designed limits within each kind, allowing crossbreeding to a certain extent. But you get to a point where you can't go beyond. So you can cross a dolphin and a whale and get something called a wholphin, but you can't go beyond that.
Right.
That's the limitation in that species.
And the hybrids are sterile.
Hybrids are generally sterile. That's
Right.
correct. But they've done a lot of things, like a tiger and a lion have been able to produce something called a liger.
Right.
And it's fascinating, but you've reached the limit of what the genetics of the kind will allow. I wanted to go back real quick and talk and give another quote that Darwin made. One of the things that I think is overlooked in this debate is what's called irreducible complexity. Irreducible complexity is a huge idea that we can talk about. Dr. Michael Behe is the one that reintroduced it. It's not totally new, but he reintroduced this concept. And when Darwin looked at the eye, at visual acuity, and he saw how many factors it took for vision to happen, he made this comment: to suppose that the eye, with so many parts all working together, could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd to the highest degree.
Yeah.
So Darwin saw the problem, and he wasn't overly dogmatic about his claims. He felt like science would be able to confirm what he was telling in his book. Science would eventually be able to confirm it and come up with an explanation of why it was the correct view.
Yes, and he also thought that the fossil record would eventually bear him out, but it has not supported his theory at all.
Exactly.
The number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed on the Earth must be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? So you're talking about that here on page 13 as well. Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this is perhaps the most obvious and gravest objection that can be urged against my theory. That's Charles Darwin himself,
and he
saying that.
That's like I said, he saw the problem. His hope was that science would vindicate him in the time to come.
Yes. Okay, is there anything else in this first chapter that you want to mention?
Just the second law of thermodynamics.
Okay, that's an important one.
It is an important one. And if you recognize that the real world starts with order and goes to disorder, life to death, organization to disorganization. So the entropy is always getting greater. And
for those who are not familiar with the word entropy, explain that.
Okay, so entropy is increased randomness, increased disorder. And so you look at the world around you, and that's what we see. Everywhere we look, we see an increase in disorder. So it's going downhill.
Yes.
With evolution, you have to be able to go uphill. And that's
Yes.
not what we see in the real world.
Yes, and sometimes it's also explained as a loss of heat, a loss of functionality. So it's going downhill, which is opposite of what evolution is supposed to be going uphill.
Exactly.
Okay.
Let me read a quote from one of my heroes of the faith, Henry Morris.
Oh, yes, Dr.
Okay.
Henry.
All right. He says, by far the most influential argument against the Bible is the widespread belief that science has proven evolution and therefore disproves the biblical account of creation. And then he says, one of the strangest paradoxes in the history of science is that a theory so barren of scientific proof as evolution could be so universally accepted as scientific fact. Science is knowledge, and the essence of the scientific method is experimentation and observation.
Right. Henry Morris was a smart guy. I've talked about him several times on the show before, and he really started the modern creation science movement in 1961 with his book. The book came out called The Genesis Flood, and then after that became popular, he started the Institute for Creation Research, which is now in Dallas, Texas, and they have a large creation museum there now that just opened up a year ago or so, which is very impressive.
Yeah, that would be awesome to see. Him and I think it was John Whitcomb?
John Whitcomb, yeah.
John Whitcomb?
That's right.
Yeah. They were powerful men, pioneers in the creation movement.
Absolutely. Yeah, good quote from Henry Morris there. Was there anything you wanted to talk about?
Well, I want to mention mutations because evolution can never get done without mutations. And they've got to be mutations that are going to be useful to the organism. Now, what most people don't realize is that the only mutation that can be passed on is one that is a mutation of the sex cells, or the sperm or the egg cell can be passed on. But every mutation is a loss of information. And when you lose information that was there to begin with, it's a downhill problem. Mm-hmm. It goes from, goes downhill, goes to worse. Like Stephen Jay Gould says, what good is half a jaw or half a wing?
Right.
So if you have a mutation that cripples an organism, it's a downhill problem.
That organism will be the first to go.
Yeah.
In nature, right?
Yeah. Not fit enough to survive.
Exactly.
So what they did was they took fruit flies and they bombarded them over and over again with radiation, UV light and radiation, and they produced a lot of weird flies.
Yeah.
But they were never able to produce something that was an improvement or something that was different than a fly. And 50 years, Richard Goldsmith worked on that with insects.
Right.
And he just threw up his hands in the end and said it's just not feasible.
That's right. And they didn't. They like to use fruit flies because they have such a short lifespan and so many generations can be in a short time.
That's right.
But yes, they've been able to modify it a lot, but they've never been able to change it to anything else but a fruit fly. And what you're mentioning there about the genetic information is that for evolution to be a theory that actually works, you would have to have a huge amount of new and beneficial information in the genome. Any of these mutations do not produce new and beneficial genetic information for any creature. So evolution has no mechanism to work. It just can't work. It's impossible to happen.
Well, not by natural selection and mutation.
No.
That's a failing
Yeah.
proposition there. But let me also say, I came across this quote. It says, I don't even know who wrote this. Disability before complexity leads to fatality. Disability before complexity leads to fatality.
Okay.
Let me give you an example of that. My wife and I read this little creation book. It talks about different aspects of creatures, plants, animals, and their features. Today we read about the giraffe. Now, the thing about a giraffe is when a baby giraffe is born, it has to be able to run immediately because of the it's a prey animal. So because of the danger, it has to be able to run as soon as it's dropped.
Yeah.
So if you look at really what God did, those hooves are already formed in the womb, and they're already strong, hard, and sharp. So they can run as soon as they're born. But what God did was he put baby boots on those giraffes so it wouldn't tear up the mom when it was being born. So it's born with this gelatin kind of boot that surrounds the hooves, and it quickly, dissipates after birth. But then they're able to move quickly.
Yes, and there's innumerable design complexities that you can state about every animal. Really, it's just amazing.
That's right.
If you looked at every animal, you would find, including ourselves, you would find amazing complexities and things like you just mentioned that's unique about the design of that creature. Now, you were mentioning about Michael Behe's irreducible complexity idea, but you didn't never really finish that. Can you finish that with an example of irreducible complexity so that people understand what that is all about and why that's such a hurdle to the evolution theory?
Sure. If you look at a lot of different features, you could look at digestion, you could look at vision. Digestion, for example, there's a lot of different parts of the body that are involved in digestion. The smell, sense of smell, the brain, the pancreas, the stomach acids, everything is working in harmony to allow for that to occur. So that's irreducibly complex. If you take away, the idea of irreducible complexity is like a mousetrap. It's made out of 5 different parts working together to produce the result. If you take away any one of those 5 parts, it's useless. Doesn't work. So that's what irreducible complexity is. And what I wanted to also mention about our examples here, when we're talking about animals that God designed with specific abilities to be able to either function by virtue of how they're created or by symbiosis because they depend on another organism to survive in tandem. The problem you look at is the question becomes, how, for example, did the giraffes survive for millions of years before somehow nature provided this way of protecting the mother during the birth of the babies?
Yes.
So survival it would be the problem. If you don't have it all to begin with, you can't survive long enough to get there.
Yes, exactly. The complexity is enormous, and we see that every time we look into something, we see this issue of complexity coming up in our face. Now, we're just about out of time, and I just want to mention the other chapters in here. Evolution, a Theory in Crisis, Case of the Missing Links, Not by Chance, Beyond the Ivory Tower, The Battle for Truth, Almighty for All Mystery, the revelation of God, the merging of science and faith, and chapter 10 is how then shall we live? Okay, so what's the conclusion? Just give us a wrap up there on the conclusion of the book.
Well, what I've done is the first 5 chapters are really laser focused on the problems with evolution theory and how it doesn't really measure up with the real world and true science. Mm-hmm. And then the last 5 chapters are basically about, okay, so if there's a super intelligence involved in the beginning of life, we have to consider, has that intelligence revealed himself? Mm-hmm. And so that's why I have the chapter Almighty or All Mystery, okay. And then how God revealed himself through Israel, through the Bible, through his incarnation, the resurrection, and then the church. People's lives that are changed because they've trusted. And what I want people to know is that the epilogue section of the book is critical in my view, because it's really easy for people to say, okay, you believe in a biblical worldview. I believe in a natural worldview. Show me that I can trust the Bible. So the whole epilogue section is designed to show people that the Bible can be trusted, that there's strong support historically for the biblical text and its accuracy and its authenticity.
Excellent. And that really is one of the main reasons for creation science, is to give Christians the confidence that they can believe in God's word over man's word, because real science, as Russ Miller likes to say, is a Christian's best friend. So I hope you know that, folks. And I want to recommend this book to you by David Peeples, The Mystery of Life, What's It All About? Discovering the Truth in a Skeptical World. And David Peeples, spelled Peeples. And you can get that on Amazon. And I highly recommend it. This is my recommendation for this week's Creation Corner. And David, thank you for being my guest here today on this program. And thank you for tuning in, and hope to see you next week. God bless.